Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle, not with a treaty, not even with murder. We begin with a door, but behind this door lies something no servant should ever see. Something not even a father should witness. Before we open it, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of history. Stories that were buried because someone in power wanted them forgotten. And do me one more favor, drop a comment with your location and what time it is where you are watching. These stories may be centuries old, but I never stop being amazed how far they still travel through time. Ready? Step closer. Listen. Because behind this door is the heir to the Spanish Empire, and they say he's begun eating himself alive. You are standing at the end of a long corridor within El Escorial, the granite labyrinth palace just outside Madrid, with its crucifix domes, crypts, and echoing silence. The tapestries hang heavy here. The air is cold, though it's not winter. This is a hallway not built for men, but for power. The stones are too large. The ceiling's too tall. The door in front of you? Too thick, too sealed, too afraid of what lies inside. And there, on either side, stand two royal guards, arms rigid, faces pale. But they're not keeping anyone out. They're keeping someone in. It was King Philip II's order, personal, handwritten, seal the chamber. Postman at all hours. He is to speak with no one until I say otherwise. Inside is Don Carlos, 17 years old, firstborn son of Spain's most powerful monarch, heir to the Habsburg crown. And, depending on who you ask, either insane, possessed, or cursed by blood. You are not his doctor. You are not his tutor. You're just a servant here to deliver his tray. You reach for the heavy brass ring on the bolt, draw it back, and then you hear it first. Not a voice, not a scream, but teeth. Gnashing. Clicking. Scraping, not at food, but at wood, at bone. The guards go rigid. Inside, something slams once against stone. Again. A third time, heavier. One guard mutters something under his breath. It might be a prayer, or a curse, or both. Then. Silence. But silence here hurts. It's thick. Too deliberate. Like the boy behind the door is waiting for someone to flinch. You knock once, gently. No reply. Then something moves again, slow this time. A dragging sound. Nails? Flesh? You don't want to know, but what chills you more than that is the smell that slinks through the crack. Stale sweat, wax, and something else. Like vinegar burned over flame. That's when the voice behind you speaks. You will say nothing of this to anyone. Do you understand? You whirl. Standing there, perfectly still, draped in black, King Philip II. His face is carved from something more ancient than marble. Calm, cold, composed. No emotion, not fear, not sorrow. Just conviction. But in his eyes, something terrifying, not sadness, just certainty. As if the thing inside that chamber were not his son, but a prophecy fulfilled. This thing behind the door, this prince, was once the future of Spain. Now, he can no longer be seen. Only fed, whispered about. Sealed. You think of the rumors that Don Carlos tried to throw himself down marble stairs, just to see if his bones would crack before the stone, that he wrapped himself in sheets, soaked with wine to keep the devil cold, that he strangled a tutor for quoting Aristotle too slowly, that he attempted to marry his own aunt twice. You weren't there, of course, but you've seen the blood, the boots covered in excrement, the night a nurse ran screaming from the room, clutching her throat. You've heard the things he mutters, sometimes in Latin, sometimes not in any language you recognize. And now you hear a soft laugh from within, delicate, childlike. Terrifying. And suddenly, you understand, this is no prison. This is the only way Spain could protect itself from its own heir, born of incest, bred in fire, shaped by saints and blades, and broken by expectations that frankly no human child was ever meant to bear. Still, Watching? Type Royal Madness in the comments if you're ready to follow this story past the gates of sanity into a royal house rotting from within, and the prince they buried before he died. Before Don Carlos could speak, before his legs could carry him awkwardly down imperial corridors, there were already whispers surrounding him, not of greatness, but of warning. To understand how this boy became the most feared prince in Europe, we need to look at the people who made him, or rather, the machine that did. The Spanish monarchy in the 1500s wasn't simply a government, it was a sermon. A divine experiment in blood, control, and religious warfare. And the man towering above that empire was Philip II, King of Spain. And guardian of Christendom. He ruled with the soft tone of a priest and the cruelty of an iron automaton. Never drunk, never uncontrolled, never smiling, his was the empire upon which, quite literally, the sun never set. Through conquest, marriage, and ruthless enforcement, Philip stitched together a sprawling crown. Spain, Naples, Sicily, Milan, the Netherlands, the Philippines, and most of the Americas. The New World bled gold back into Iberian vaults under his authority. And yet, he ruled as if he were tending a crumbling chapel made of souls, instead of stone. His enemies weren't just Protestants, they were doubt, heresy, and dishonor. Any crack in the holy armor of the royal family. To defeat such things, he believed, one needed spiritual purity, not just in faith, but in flesh, which brings us to the Habsburg strategy. Preserve power by marrying it to itself. Philip II was the son of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and Isabella of Portugal, both Habsburgs. And when he came of age, he embraced the family tradition, marrying his first cousin, Maria of Portugal. Yes, the woman who would become the mother of Don Carlos was Philip's cousin by blood, multiple times over. Let no impurity enter the house of righteousness. A Jesuit bishop once wrote during Carlos's birth celebrations. He had no idea how ironic those words would become. The Habsburgs saw this intermarriage not as morally questionable, but as divine reinforcement. They believed they were God's chosen bloodline, and mixing outside of it would dilute the holy mission entrusted to their family. But biology does not kneel to theology. And so, with each generation, the weaknesses grew. A protruding lower jaw that deformed speech, weak bones. Club feet. Infertility. And, more dangerously, volatile mental instability masked by royal ceremony. Historians today call it the Habsburg curse. A genetic time bomb created by generations of incestuous matchmaking. Dressed up in velvet and paraded through cathedrals. Carlos was born into this mess on July 8, 1545, barely 9 months into his parents' marriage. From the moment he cried out in the royal nursery, everything was wrong. He was delivered prematurely. His skull was mishapen. His fontanelle, the soft part of the crown infants grow into, remained open far longer than usual, leading one physician to quietly speculate if heaven had marked this child for trials greater than others. His mother, Maria, died just 4 days after childbirth. The baby lived, but the queen did not. Carlos would grow up without a mother, and under the gaze of a father who could never unsee the cost of his birth. Philip II never remarried out of love. His later political marriages were strategic, cautious, bloodless affairs. And yet, he never forgave Maria's ghost for leaving him with a child he couldn't comprehend, a son who smelled of divine punishment more than divine inheritance. And so while others celebrated the child's potential, Philip watched for signs of rot. He employed priests as wet nurses. Jesuit tutors drilled Latin into Carlos's ears before the child could even form full sentences. His meals were regulated, his holy education calibrated. His nursing staff was rotated every few months. He wasn't allowed to form too many attachments, only piety, only discipline, only duty. Still, the whispers in the palace spread like wax over portraits. Carlos didn't walk correctly. He had fits. He smiled too. Long. He was obsessed with funerals. One courtier confessed in an unsigned letter, smuggled to the ambassador of Venice. He is watched constantly, even while he sleeps. The nurses report that he screams not from nightmares, but from dreams where everyone bows and then burns. Sometimes he asks to be tied down at night. Other times we have no choice. The priests claimed this was a trial from God, a chance for the Father's iron faith to purify the illness of the Son. Philip took this seriously. He fasted. He ordered multiple masses daily on Carlos's behalf. He commissioned new paintings of tortured saints and hung them in the boy's room for him to meditate upon. He believed that if Carlos saw enough agony, he might learn to overcome his own. But it didn't work. By the time Carlos turned 10, the questions whispered behind closed doors were no longer if he was unstable. It was what must be done. When the heir is unfit to inherit, not just unfit to rule, but perhaps unfit to remain alive. They tried to dress him like any other royal child, silks of crimson and black, a ceremonial sword too heavy for his belt, golden slippers hand-stitched by Flemish artisans. His tutors spoke Latin and Spanish with equal precision, expecting him to rise to majesty. But Don Carlos could barely look people in the eye. At 7 years old, he still walked with an uneven gait, rigid and awkward, his malformed right leg dragging slightly behind him like half-forgotten luggage. His skull remained unusually shaped, flattened at the crown, oddly elongated, with one eye set slightly deeper than the other. When he smiled, it refused to match properly on both sides of his face. And yet, he smiled often, too often, and at the wrong times. No royal physician dared say it, but it was obvious even then. Don Carlos was unwell. More than unwell, he was. Off in ways doctors couldn't chart. He could be quiet for hours, unmoving, so frozen in place that handmaidens thought him dead, then erupt into shrieking rages over nothing at all. He once attacked a priest who offered him a silver crucifix. Another time, he climbed halfway out a palace window, claiming he wanted to see God's feet. At age 8, he was found in the garden pulling the wings off butterflies, muttering psalms backwards. Twice, he stabbed his own hand without flinching, simply to watch the bleeding pattern spread into the grass. But the most chilling thing? He was always lucid afterward. "I am not in pain," he told his tutor coldly. "Only waiting to inherit." Waiting, that was the storm inside him, the impossible pressure of future kingship coiled, like a snake around a skull that never formed right. He had no mother to comfort him. Maria of Portugal, his mother, had died mere days after childbirth. Her portrait hung over his bed, but no stories were passed down. No songs. No softness. Only silence, and the soft humming of nuns just outside his room, chronicling prayers for the salvation of his soul. His father, King Philip II, was distant, not abusive, not cruel, just deliberate, surgical in his rejection. Philip visited Carlos rarely, and when he did, it was formal, cold, almost administrative. "Show me your Latin. Bow deeper. Have you been confessing regularly?" Carlos learned that love was earned not through being a son, but through becoming acceptable, whatever that meant. Scribes from the court left scattered and disturbing impressions. One noted that young Carlos would sometimes insist he was born dead and had returned without permission. Another reported the prince claimed to see men with no hands in the hallway, grabbing at him when no one looked. No one knew what to do, because no one was allowed to. The Inquisition was strong in Spain now, swelling under Philip's reign. Anything resembling abnormality could be considered heresy if interpreted through the wrong lens. A malformed boy with violent urges, born of incestuous blood, raised old questions. Was it sin that made him this way? Or a curse on the entire dynasty? And still, Carlos was the heir. That made everything worse. Because even in private, no one was brave enough to confront the darkness gathering inside this child. He lit a servant's robe on fire once, just to see if the Holy Spirit would protect him. He tried to suffocate a younger page with holy water-soaked cloth. And each time punishment was whispered, Carlos would scream that he was the future king, and he would remember who was loyal and who disappointed heaven. He demanded to be addressed not as Prince Carlos, but Carlos el Justo, Carlos the Just, claiming angels had given him the title in sleep. One night, a nurse heard him pacing barefoot in his chamber, stopping only to whisper at the Politico door, "I've already outlived more than one shadow placed inside me. Haven't I, mother?" But his mother was dust, and the shadows were winning. Still, the court held out hope. He's just a difficult boy, a royal eccentric. After all, madness and greatness had danced together through history often enough. But the rest of Spain, especially the nobles who would someday kneel to this boy, began to worry, because Don Carlos wasn't just violent. He was manipulative, calculated, and entitled to destroy. He understood he couldn't be touched, not by law, not by priests, not even by the cold eye of his father, not yet. The future king of Spain lived in a mansion of mirrors, every corridor echoing his own twisted reflection back at him. And the child inside that house learned early that the world bent to fear faster than it bent to love. And fear, Carlos would learn to command. All he had to do was survive his own mind long enough. On paper, Don Carlos's adolescence looked promising. He was the Prince of Spain, the heir to the greatest empire on earth, an honored Catholic royal who would one day inherit ships, cities, viceroys, and entire continents he never had to see. He wore crimson, kissed relics, attended mass, and glared through walls at ministers 3 times his age. But while Philip II plotted marriages like a chessboard across Europe, seeking alliances with England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, Carlos had simpler goals. He wanted a bride who wouldn't flinch when he cried at night. He wanted a woman he didn't feel had more power than him. And there were only 2 kinds of women who met that standard in his world: servants and family. At age 14, Don Carlos received formal letters of engagement, suggesting matches with foreign royal women: Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of the French king, a young Austrian archduchess from the Habsburg circle, even briefly Mary, Queen of Scots. Each woman was painted, praised, evaluated like livestock. But Carlos, for all his political importance, only ever seemed interested in one match. A match that would horrify Europe. His cousin, his aunt, the newly widowed daughter of Emperor Charles V, Joanna of Austria. His own father's sister. To be clear, this wasn't technically criminal under Habsburg ideology. Royals had centuries of tangled bloodlines. But for Don Carlos, the obsession wasn't some abstract dynastic continuation. It was all-consuming, emotional, possessive, loaded with desperate need, masked as holy affection. Witnesses wrote that Carlos would watch Joanna during court ceremonies, silent and fixated. He once refused to eat for 2 days when she traveled without telling him. He demanded to be seated next to her during meals. Once, he ordered a troubled portrait, burned solely because it displayed her hand positioned too far from his. He began referring to her as mi espejo, my mirror. And when questioned, he explained, "Only her eyes understand what the blood feels. We were born of the same fire." Joanna was 10 years older, gracious, politically savvy, and perhaps at first, kindly tolerant of Carlos's fragile obsession. But it darkened quickly. When he was 16, Carlos demanded the council write a petition to allow the marriage. Despite her being his aunt, despite church restrictions, despite every scandal such a union would inflame, the court refused. Carlos exploded. He trashed his room, shattered holy icons, tore open holy texts, shouting that God was a tyrant, and locked himself inside his bedchamber for 2 days with only a dagger, threatening to cut the Habsburg curse from his blood. It was the first time royal physicians recorded a complete break from reality. And behind it was not politics. It was rejection. Afterward, things got worse. He developed severe migraines, but refused most treatments, instead adopting pain as atonement. He carried rosaries made of bone. He prayed aloud in strange, violent scripts. He began to follow certain maids, whispering cryptic marriage vows in the gardens, asking if they believed new kings could resurrect in different skin. One chambermaid swore he tried to push her down a staircase after she rejected a kiss. Court hagiographers, those carefully placed storytellers who wrote official histories, began editing Carlos nearly out of royal images. His portraits were paused. His name skipped in certain diplomatic talks. Underneath the palace stillness, there was a growing question. What happens if the heir is not rebellious, but rotting from within? Still, Philip hoped marriage might fix him. Control him. Tame love into duty. So, in a shock to everyone, Carlos was betrothed in press to the same girl intended for him earlier, Elizabeth of Valois, the French princess, only 13 years old. She was refined, educated, beautiful, and perfect royal stock. But then, just before the wedding took place, Philip married her himself. Yes, his father married the woman once promised to Carlos. The marriage of necessity, part of the peace deal after the Italian wars, needed a politically appropriate match. Carlos was too unstable, too dangerous. So Philip married Elizabeth instead of his son. For Don Carlos, this was more than rejection. It was humiliation so deep, it broke something in him permanently. From then on, Carlos stopped pretending to play prince. He spoke to mirrors and expected answers. He muttered prayers while staring at pedestals for hours. He dressed beneath portraits of his lost mother and whispered that no woman would steal her place again. They tried sending noble women to see him, known as comfort visits. One wrote back to Philip in chilling words, "My lord, the prince has confused lust with ritual. I fear for his mind, and what he intends for mine." Don Carlos never married, but he wasn't celibate either. Servants claimed he took pleasure in the terror of rejection more than affection itself. That one look of fear in a woman's eyes gave him more control than vows ever could. And the court discreet, trembling, let it happen, because marrying a madman is sinful, but acknowledging a royal crime? That could collapse a throne. The first body didn't fall with a scream. There was no orchestral crash, no public declaration. No one even called it murder. But everyone in the royal court knew what had happened. And worse, they knew it couldn't be spoken of. Because when a crown prince kills, it isn't death. It's an incident. And Don Carlos, heir to one of the most powerful monarchies in all of Europe, had just triggered his first one. It began with lingering obsession. And a woman who tried to resist it, her name has been lost. 10 different versions survive. Some chronicles simply call her La Doncella Rubia, the fair-haired maiden. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth of Valois, Philip I's new young French bride. And Carlos's secret fixation, whether she mirrored his long-dead mother or resembled his Aunt Joanna, whom he had once begged to marry, no one knows. But what's absolutely clear is this: Carlos began watching her. Constantly, he followed her across courtyards. He appeared beside her at meals uninvited. One witness said he asked her, "Do you see me as a king or as a god wearing a broken crown?" She laughed. That was her mistake. Carlos demanded she visit him for confession. She refused. He ordered she be reassigned to a lower station in the palace. When the queen objected, Carlos flew into a rage so violent that he was reportedly restrained by 4 guards while threatening to gouge out his own eyes for divine vengeance. Later that night, witnesses said he smashed stained glass windows with a golden cruet, cutting into his bare feet and walking the halls laughing. 3 days later, the woman vanished. Gone. Not reassigned. Not transferred. Just Gone. Court officials quickly hushed the matter. Her family was paid. Others speculated she had been deported back to France. But among the staff, everyone knew she had gone to Carlos's room and she hadn't come out. From that point forward, something shifted in Don Carlos and in the palace. He stopped wearing religious ornamentation. He stopped appearing at prayer. He began talking to carvings in the church walls, whispering to cherub statues as if they were his confessors. He was seen dragging books through the garden, quoting the book of Job until his throat bled. God broke me with birth, he told a page, but he will keep me whole in death. Soon, even his body began changing. He lost weight rapidly, then gained it. His face looked swollen 1 week, skeletal the next. He refused to eat meat, then devoured whole trays of veal without pausing. He swung violently between religious fasting and profound gluttony. Some days he wore sackcloth robes and beat himself with leather cords. Other days he called for sweet wine, ripped off his clothes, and laid beneath tapestries, screaming for God to burn the worms from his belly. The priests were terrified. The doctors were helpless. His father? Silent, but behind the thick walls of El Escorial, the puzzles were becoming patterns. Then came the window incident. Carlos had been obsessively requesting access to the upper library chamber where rare manuscripts of alchemical transmutation and heavenly astrology were kept. It was denied. The books were fragile, and Carlos's mental condition was considered volatile. So one night, he climbed 3 stories, unassisted, in full robes, nursing scars, muttering scripture backwards. By the time someone noticed him clinging to the upper stone lattice, he was balanced horribly between heaven and earth, bleeding from his palms as he carved a cross into the windowsill. I am the sacrifice, he screamed from above the courtyard, and I will fly. My blood will repair the line. It took 5 guards to pull him down. He bit one of them, clean through the flesh. Another he kicked so hard in the ribs, he broke bone. Carlos was 21, barely more than a boy, but now fully untethered from the world. That made him, and the palace, had no plan. No precedent, because deposing a king was possible, imprisoning a prince was not. There was, however, another option, silencing him. Within palace walls. Quietly. No shackles, no trials. Just remove him from sight, and let the walls handle the rest. Later historians would call this decision sad but inevitable. A few called it murder by delay, but among the king's closest advisors, there was no debate anymore. Spain could not survive the boy's next disaster. And as for Carlos, he didn't resist. They came for him in the night. He laughed. He asked if the queen had come with them. He told them he was finally ready to meet the king who waits behind all kings. Then he vanished behind the bolted chamber door, the one you now recognize from the very beginning of our tale. And from that point on, he was no longer the crown prince. He was the empire's shame. There are many ways to kill a person without raising a blade. One is silence. Another is confinement, and the most effective is total control of their reality. When Don Carlos was locked away in January of 1568, the official line was clear. He was being protected from himself. He had requested a private retreat. He was ill, naturally, spiritually, not criminally. But the truth? He was not put into isolation. He was buried alive. His room was once a noble chamber, rich tapestries, warm glass windows, cedar furniture. Under King Philip II's orders, it was transformed into something else. The windows were bricked up from the outside, the carpets removed, the candles reduced, mirrors, icons, and writing implements taken away, the wooden furniture replaced with stone and iron. The guards instructed to never speak his name, ever. Carlos was now no longer a prince. He was a dangerous manuscript sealed inside a coffin of his own bloodline. Philip paid physicians to keep him alive, but not to comfort him. To watch. To chart his decline. Like a royal experiment. In the early weeks, Carlos shouted through the door endlessly. God, his mother, his aunt. He believed he was being abducted by devils in Spanish armor. He refused all food, then demanded only raw meat, then vinegar and ashes. He wrote secret letters on torn linen using his own blood, claiming his soul had been swapped with a beggar's heart, and that angels were screaming inside his bones. One note allegedly read, "They make me kneel before nothing. The king knows. He watches behind the wall. I am dead and awake in the wrong skin." Another was addressed simply, "To the Pope, tell my father he has violated the tomb of heaven. The crown must fail." Impossible allegations, or perhaps prophecy. As the weeks dragged into months, Carlos's condition withered into something grotesque. Multiple attendants reported he began pulling out his toenails, then swallowing bits of glass, stone, and iron nails hidden in the walls. He believed his body needed to be pierced so the evil fluids could drain. He stopped sleeping. He tore open his mattress and curled up inside its frame until he had to be forced out. He drank his own urine to prove he could survive war. Within the spirit, a nun assigned to observe him fainted after watching him attempt to amputate his own finger with a butter knife. The Holy Spirit has no grip in this skull. She later whispered, "He is elsewhere." Eventually, even the servants began praying outside his cell, not for deliverance, but that he would die. That he would finally cross over into divine judgment, where someone more merciful than his father might finally understand him. But Philip II refused. He continued to oversee every meal, every report. He reduced his son's food further with each month, allegedly as both punishment and purification. One ambassador wrote home, "Our king rules with crosses and ropes. He speaks of mercy but crafts methods of forgetting." What lives behind his son's door is not illness. It is an echo of Spain's soul. The worst of it may never be known. Some records were destroyed. Others erased in later centuries by embarrassed descendants. But archivists in Madrid uncovered one forbidden file recently, detailing a secret procedure authorized by the king's personal physician, a bloodletting operation performed on Carlos in May of 1568. Not to heal him, but to reduce the humors of pride and rebellion. He was bled until unconscious, not once, not twice, 9 times. In under 2 weeks, his weight dropped dangerously. His teeth became loose. His feet swelled and bruised. His eyes sunk deeper each day. That it was not treatment, that it was ritual. Fragility. King Philip's twisted form of saving what he once believed was his sacred heir. And yet, even now, Carlos fought back in fragments. He would smear his blood into symbols. He scrawled hidden warnings on the underside of flagstones, Latin phrases invoking fire, judgment, plague. On the 131st night, a guard reported hearing him whisper, "They will write my name as madness. Let them. I will stain the pages forever." Another night, he sang lullabies in Portuguese, the language of his dead mother, until his throat bled, and he was left hoarse for weeks. The sound of the prince never truly stopped. It changed, shifted. Sometimes moans, sometimes raspy laughter, sometimes screams that went on too long for lungs that sized. And eventually, the entire palace stopped mentioning him altogether, because even without speaking, Don Carlos had now become a ghost. Not dead, not alive, just permanently locked in a royal chapter Spain would never reopen. They locked a boy behind a door, but they couldn't lock the world out. And when Don Carlos vanished from view, the silence didn't still the kingdom. It amplified the echo. At first, the court whispered that their prince was ill, exhausted, spiritually tormented. But dignitaries from France, England, Rome, and the German principalities had eyes inside every palace. And soon enough, ambassadors began to report the same unimaginable truth. The Spanish heir has disappeared. The king speaks only of God. The empire has no face and no voice. What followed wasn't just a diplomatic setback, it was political. Anesthesia, a creeping paralysis. Philip II had married Elizabeth of Valois, the French princess originally betrothed to Don Carlos, not out of love, but to stabilize Spain's fragile peace with Catholic and Protestant factions in Europe. The union was supposed to cement loyalty, but now? Philip had no son, no legitimate heir in public view, no future. Don Carlos had been entirely erased from maps, missions, portraits, prayers. And foreign powers noticed. The French court became suspicious. The papal envoys pressed quietly for proof of Carlos's health. Even the Ottoman agents in the Mediterranean reported back that Philip suffers some internal inheritance crisis, a matter of blood, corruption, or divine punishment. It didn't take long before rumors hardened into theories, and theories into accusations. Some claimed Carlos had died. Others said he was kept as a mad animal. A few claimed Philip had him poisoned on the advice of Jesuit confessor priests who feared the devil was in his blood. There is fire in the royal house, one French bishop famously wrote, but the smoke is suffocating the whole continent. At the same time, Spain's foreign campaigns began cracking. The war in the Netherlands flared into full rebellion. Rebels used the disappearance of Carlos as Catholic betrayal, evidence the Spanish crown was unstable. English Protestants circulated prints showing Philip as Herod, slaughtering his own lineage to preserve power. In Italy, a merchant newsletter dated July 1568 literally said, "Philip II, most Catholic of kings, cannot control his own household, yet seeks to govern the lives of millions." Public mockery was rare for Spain's monarchy to be satirized. Internationally was outright unprecedented. And while Philip projected control to the outside world, funding more shrines, doubling religious processions, commissioning art of judgment, his eyes had grown hollow, his pain was invisible, but powerful. He had already buried his son. Now he had to politically bury the body. The court released no official death certificate, but they began constructing the narrative of declining health and private suffering. Months passed. Then years. Carlos's name was slowly erased. His royal crest was removed from new minted coins. Diplomatic treaties excluded his succession. Even palace portraits with Carlos's face were painted over, or simply disappeared. By the time Carlos had been missing publicly for a year, most European nobles just assumed he was dead. And behind his door, he was barely alive. The obscene irony? Carlos wasn't even Philip's only problem. In the same 2 years, his queen, Elizabeth of Valois, died, shockingly and young. While pregnant, his navy suffered rebellion in the Netherlands. The Morisco Revolt erupted in southern Spain, 1568, driven by a Muslim population brutally targeted by conversion laws. The treasury began bleeding from war. Debts and crackdown costs. Everything Philip had tried to hold together through bloodlines, loyalty, and faith was now slipping through his fingers like ash. Through all of it, not a word spoken of Carlos. Some courtiers came to believe this was divinely earned, that by suppressing his son, Philip had provoked the wrath of heaven. One Jesuit confessor reportedly told the king privately, "You placed holiness above mercy. God forgives, but kingdoms. Remember." And if God didn't punish him, Carlos would. Even absent, even sick, even dying, he lived in the minds of rebels. Protestant pamphlets used Carlos's madness as proof that divine monarchy was a lie. Dutch revolutionaries toasted to the prince in prison. And political exiles across Europe kept circulating one phrase in letters and meetings: Carlos lives. Spain drowns in silence. The fractures left in Spain's identity after Carlos's disappearance would go on to shape Europe's wars for decades. And even after his death, Spain refused to speak his name, as though by forgetting him, they could cleanse the ghost from the throne. But royals know, you cannot exorcise blood. only spill it. Centuries later, historians still argue, was Don Carlos a monster or a martyr? Was he a victim of his own blood or of a father's fear? But the most disturbing truth is this: none of it mattered, because the Habsburg dynasty was already doomed by the very hands that tried to save it. After Carlos's disappearance, the Spanish court worked overtime to erase his memory. His name was struck from prayers. His portraits were painted over. His rooms were sealed. His belongings burned or hidden. But the ghost of the prince would not be so easily exorcised. Rumors began to swirl, first in whispers, then in letters, then in the open streets of Madrid and Paris and Rome. Some said Carlos had escaped and was living in disguise, plotting revenge. Others claimed he had fathered a child with a palace maid, and that the true heir to Spain was now a bastard, hidden in a monastery. But the most persistent and most poisonous rumor was this: Don Carlos was never meant to be king, that the real heir, the one with a sound mind, a strong body, and a heart not twisted by inbreeding, had been born to another woman, or even to another branch of the family. That Philip's obsession with blood purity had blinded him to the possibility that his own son was unfit, and that by locking Carlos away, he had not saved the dynasty, but doomed it to collapse. Some whispered that Carlos's madness was not a curse, but a warning, a sign that the Habsburg line was running out of time, that the price of their divine blood was now being paid in full. And as the years passed, the irony only deepened. Philip remarried, but his later children were sickly, short-lived, or died in infancy. The Habsburg jaw grew more pronounced, the eyes more sunken, the minds more fragile. By the time Philip's grandson, Charles II, took the throne, the dynasty was a shadow of its former self, a king so deformed and feeble that he could barely speak, let alone rule. The last Habsburg, one ambassador wrote, is a living corpse. Spain is ruled by a ghost. And all the while, the story of Don Carlos lingered, a prince who was locked away, not for what he did, but for what he was, a father who tried to save his kingdom by destroying his son, and in doing so, destroyed the very thing he hoped to protect. The ultimate irony? The Habsburgs' obsession with blood purity, their refusal to let outsiders into the family, their desperate attempts to control fate, all of it led, inexorably, to their own extinction. The line that was supposed to last forever ended in madness, sterility, and death. And Don Carlos, the prince who was never king, became the symbol of everything the dynasty feared most, a legacy of rot, regret, and ruin. In the end, the story of Don Carlos is not just a tale of personal tragedy. It is warning, a mirror held up to every family, every nation, every leader who believes they can outwit fate, who thinks they can control the uncontrollable. Because the more you try to lock away your demons, the more likely they are to inherit your crown. The end, when it came, was not a royal passing. It was a slow, private rot. Don Carlos died on July 24, 1568. After 6 months of confinement, he was just 20-3. No bells tolled. No public mourning. No grand funeral procession through the streets of Madrid. Instead, the news was whispered first among the guards, then the priests, then the terrified servants who had watched the prince waste away behind a door that no one dared open. The official story was natural causes, but the truth was written on the corpse. When they finally entered his chamber, the stench was overwhelming. The air was thick with the sour, metallic tang of blood and decay. The prince's body was emaciated, the skin stretched tight over bone, the eyes sunken and glassy. His fingernails were gone, torn out or bitten off. His feet were swollen, blackened with bruises. His lips were cracked, his teeth loose, his gums bleeding. There were deep, self-inflicted cuts on his arms and legs, bruises on his chest and neck, patch of scalp where the hair had been ripped out in clumps. The mattress was shredded, the sheets stained with blood, urine, and something darker. On the wall, written in his own blood, was a single word: pardon. Forgive. The doctors who examined the body were sworn to secrecy, but rumors leaked out of a heart shriveled and black, of organs twisted and malformed, of a brain that seemed too small for the skull that held it. Some said the prince had been poisoned slowly by his own father. Others claimed he had starved himself to death, refusing all food but vinegar and water in a final act of defiance. A few whispered that the Inquisition had performed secret exorcisms, trying to drive out the demons that had haunted him since birth. But the most persistent rumor was the most disturbing: that Don Carlos's heart was removed from his body and sent to the Vatican, as proof that the Habsburg line had finally paid its debt to God. No one knows if it's true. The records are gone, the evidence buried with the prince, but the legend remains. Philip II did not attend his son's burial. He did not weep, did not pray, did not speak the boy's name again. Instead, he ordered the chamber sealed, the servants dismissed, the doctor sent away. He commissioned a single, anonymous tomb in the royal crypt. No inscription, no honor, no memory. The court moved on. The empire lurched forward, but the shadow of Don Carlos lingered. In the years that followed, the story of the Mad Prince became a ghost story whispered in the halls of El Escorial. Servants claimed to hear scratching behind locked doors. Priests reported seeing a pale figure wandering the corridors at night, muttering prayers in a language no one recognized. Some said the prince's spirit haunted his father, appearing in dreams, demanding the forgiveness that was never given in life. And as the Habsburg line withered, as kings grew weaker, as Spain's empire crumbled, the legend of Don Carlos only grew. He became a symbol of everything the dynasty had tried to hide: the price of pride, the cost of control, the horror of a family that would rather destroy itself than admit its own sickness. In the end, Don Carlos was not just a prince who died behind a door. He was a warning, a body left to rot in the dark, a secret that refused to stay buried, a curse that would haunt Spain for generations. Centuries have passed since the doors of El Escorial were sealed, since the last cries of Don Carlos faded into stone. But the echoes remain, because the story of Spain's Mad Prince is not just a royal tragedy. It is a mirror held up to every age, every family, every nation that believes it can lock away its darkness and survive. What happened to Don Carlos was not a fluke. It was not a single act of cruelty, or a father's failure, or a son's curse. It was the inevitable result of a system built on denial, on the belief that power can be preserved by hiding pain, that bloodlines can be purified by closing doors, that trauma can be erased by silence. But trauma does not die in the dark. Festers. Mutats. That becomes the next generation's inheritance. The Habsburgs believed they could outwit fate by marrying only their own, by keeping their secrets inside stone walls, by sacrificing the weak for the sake of the strong. But in the end, their obsession with purity became their poison. Their refusal to face the sickness in their own house doomed them to extinction. Don Carlos was not the only victim. He was the symptom of a disease that infected an entire empire, a disease of pride, of fear, of control at any cost. And the cost was everything. Spain's golden age ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, a line of kings who could not rule, a nation that could not heal, a legacy that could not be cleansed. So what do we learn from this? That power without compassion is a curse, that families, like nations, must face their wounds or be destroyed by them, that the ghosts we lock away do not disappear. They wait, patient, for the day we are weakest. Still watching? Comment Royal Madness below if you made it to the end. And remember, the next time you hear a story about a mad prince, a cruel king, or a family that eats itself alive, ask not just what happened behind the door. Ask what happened to everyone who tried to pretend it wasn't there, because history is not Just what we remember. It's what we refuse to face. Thank you for watching. If this story haunted you, like and subscribe for more true tales from the shadows of power. And never forget, past is never really dead. It's just waiting for someone to open the door.